People seem upbeat and chatty today. Anything people want to share? Anything fun or interesting? What's up?
Did anybody else do the chemistry exam this morning? Yeah, we did a chemistry exam. I'm feeling great because it's over.
Anyone else? Yeah.
Tomorrow for BSU we're having like a barbecue in the Haverty Circle. It starts at 6. If you want to stop by before going, come and try whatever else is happening for homecoming. There'll be food, music, games.
Which organization is this?
Black Student Union.
Oh, I think I just heard the acronym wrong.
Oh, BSU, yeah.
So, yeah. Cool. Any other announcements? I know that you don't have to be a sociologist to join, but the defunct sociology club is going to be resurrected soon. We have a meeting at Benedetto's tomorrow at 3:45.
Wait, what was it?
Oh, the sociology club's going to be resurrected. So it's coming back from the dead, hopefully. Do you guys know Bridget McCormick?
I love Bridget.
So Bridget is going to be the president, I think. So she's going to lead up. She got elected as president before I closed. So you're all invited if you want to partake in that. So okay, let's talk about. Anybody have any practical questions for us? Last class I had some questions about the term paper, so I didn't know if people had. No. Oh, yeah.
You said like 5 to 10 sources. Is it okay if we have more?
Oh yeah, you can have as many sources as you want. If you want to read them, yeah, by all means.
Is there like a certain number of citations that you like basically in the paper?
Like in text you mean, or at the end?
Like, in text, I guess, from like the, you know how we're like supposed to be gathering articles like you just said?
Yeah.
Like, usually with other professors, they give me like, make sure you include at least like 5 to 10 in-text citations or whatever. Is there a certain number that you want?
There isn't, but like as a general rule, like really if you say anything in a paper, like you almost need to cite it. So like any factual claim has to be cited, I'm not gonna like go through with a fine-tooth comb and be like, 10 points, you didn't cite it right. But like technically speaking, anything that's not supposed to be your own words, or your own thoughts.
Yeah.
Basically, like if you're not interpreting a text, you really need to cite the text. But yeah, so yeah.
How many pages?
It was 12. Cool.
Does 12 pages include like how they have it set up here where it's title?
No. Unless I guess like the first page, if you do if you're using MLA and you do the like short thing at the top, then it would count. But like if you have like a title page or something, then that's a little too much to there's only like 5 words on that page. Does that make sense? Because like there's this small format, right, where you have like your name, I don't know, my name, something else is there, and the title's in the middle. It's underlined, right? Is that still how it's done? Yeah. If you use that counts as a page because most of it's still text. Anything else? If you can't tell, I'm not a stickler for your format. And like I said, when I said this about being a speech teacher, I'm not an English teacher either, right? So and I haven't used MLA since I was 20 years old, so, I don't really hold that, like I'm not gonna notice if your format's wonky. If you want to include subtitles, I had this question, somebody was asking if they could use subtitles, I can't remember who it was. Was it in here that somebody asked that? Apparently not. If you want to use subtitles to delineate different sections, like, yeah, that's totally cool too. Like, I think it'll make it more clear. So I'm willing to give you a lot of gradients on how you want to structure your paper. The only thing I really care about is that it has an introduction and a conclusion so that you're practicing tying all your points together, and then that there seems to be some sort of logical arrangement to the rest of the paper. Like, I like to think of it as telling a story. That's how I like to think about writing. Like, you're kind of walking me through something as a guide, right? You're taking me on a journey. If you think of it that way, I think it's kind of like, so you tell us where you're going to go. At the end, you kind of debrief and you tell us where we're going. And in the middle, just kind of like, take me on a journey through the stuff that you're thinking about when it comes to the things you're reading, right? Make sense? That's like, just like friendly writer advice. So. Okay. Let's go ahead and get to the article. So today we're going to talk about risk in the spectral politics of disability. So the first thing we should probably get down, just because the author kind of assumes that you guys know what this means and never really explains it. Do people know what eugenics is? A couple people. Anybody want to venture an explanation of eugenics? Anyone? Okay, go ahead.
I guess it's kind of like the science of using genes to produce superior human beings. That can go a lot of ways. It used to be like a really well respected field of science, and then after World War II, when the Germans used it, everybody was like, oh, okay, that's not cool. But
Yeah.
So it's just like modifying like people kind of.
Yeah, that's exactly what it is. It's an attempt to basically like modify human beings to make us into basically a superior race of people. That's the idea behind eugenics. It's named after one of the major students of Charles Darwin, Eugene Holton, who is the founder of eugenics. Eugenics is usually talked about as either being positive eugenics or negative eugenics. What might be an example of something that you would do? And I think most people nowadays, and you sort of indicated this, it's more like a pseudoscience than it is a real science. But yeah, nonetheless, like it has a feeling of being scientific. So what would you do if you were trying to, if you actively believed in eugenics and you wanted to create government policies that, you know, basically increased better genes for human beings? What would you do? What would be some of your policies? They're not good policies, by the way. Which is why people are wary of it. You kind of pointed to one. What was the one that you were indicating? You had said in World War II.
yeah, so the first thing, like before the Holocaust started, the first thing that the German government really did was forced sterilizations, like hundreds of thousands of women. So like if you were like disabled or of an inferior race, a lot of different things, like if you were homosexual, I'll have to know about that. It's probably interesting to sterilize you in that case. But yeah, if you were disabled, they would definitely say like you need to be sterilized and you don't really have much of a choice about it.
Yeah.
So that was their way of starting to create those.
Yeah, that is probably the most common form of eugenics practice is sterilization. While we're on Germany, there's another policy that would also fall under eugenics, which comes after the sterilization. All of us know the proper name of this policy usually. The Holocaust. Right? Another form of positive eugenics is genocide. Right? You get rid of whole groups of people who you see as having inferior genes. So yeah, sterilization, pretty common actually. We did a lot of it in the United States as well. Does anybody know what populations in the United States we used to sterilize before World War II? Even a little after World War II. Anybody aware of this history at all? Oh, so we used to sterilize African Americans. That was really common. We would sterilize African Americans essentially by they go in for medical procedures, they'd sign paperwork they couldn't read, and then they'd sterilize them without actually telling them they did it. They used to sterilize mental patients in the United States, people with disabilities. All those are very common. In fact, like most mental health facilities sterilized all of their patients in the United States. At least like long-term state hospitals. So those are all examples of what's called positive eugenics. Positive means it's active. That's kind of what they indicate by the word positive. There's also a series of policies that we used to implement called negative. Sorry, I just blanked on the word I used 100 times already. Eugenics, negative eugenics. Like what? Like other than keeping people from reproducing, what is another thing you would do if you wanted to make human beings in the United States have better genes that you define better? If you're a eugenics person.
Encouraging people with like better means to reproduce.
Yeah, you encourage people to reproduce. This was actually the origins of one of our tax policies that we still have. You guys familiar with something that you get a discount on your taxes for doing?
Having more children.
Yeah, if you have children, you get a discount on your taxes. Why would that be? Why do you think you would do that as an incentive?
Oh. Well, I mean, people want to pay less in taxes, so they're going to want to have more kids. They don't have to pay as much in taxes.
So is it that the country, when they originally developed this, was it that they wanted everyone to have more kids? Who doesn't have kids right away? Who sits around and thinks about their finances when they go to have children?
Probably really wealthy people.
Yeah, middle class and above. Middle class and above white people are the people who really like only have children, right? If it financially makes sense to do so. You get a lot of news articles that are slightly like eugenics-y popping up right now and talking about, so we know in terms of having children, like there's a population, like wealthy white people are taking longer to have children, right? And a lot of them are opting out of having children altogether. People who are higher educated wait to have children, or they don't have children at all. This is really common in the United States. And a lot of people are really afraid that that will, in essence, have this negative impact on our population over time. That's latently kind of a eugenics philosophy, right? There's originally similar concerns that in the early 20th century led people to develop tax laws to promote having children, so that essentially it creates a financial benefit to having children to sort of convince people to have children younger, who would otherwise wait. So that, despite what it is now, which now it's just a tax benefit if you want to have more children, I don't think people actively think of it that way anymore. But initially it was tied up in eugenics. So, like, all really bad ideas, eugenics doesn't disappear, it just kind of changes, right? So like most people, and this is sort of like the same thing, like if you think about like this, a lot of what we've talked about in this class, is things used to be really blatant, right? We used to have really blatant racism, we used to have really, right? And now things became more subtle, right? And so you have subtler forms of, you have colorblind racism as opposed to the Klan, right? You have, and in a lot of ways you could say we have subtler eugenics, but it still kind of floats around as a philosophy. And so our articles kind of look at one of those like subtle versions of eugenics, which is what happens at sperm banks. Okay, so I think for this article, it's probably best to just kind of start with the beginning. Did anybody catch the case? What's going on in this, the case that this article is looking at? surrounds a specific sperm donor. Patient 9623. Did I catch anything about this? Yeah.
Well, they like thought like this person, like on paper, was basically like the perfect donor, but then they found out like this person actually was diagnosed with schizophrenia.
Yeah. So on the surface, when he fills out all the forms to donate sperm, they may catch this list. Starts on page 30. He has an IQ of 160. Speaks 4 languages. Is a talented drummer. Apparently, being a musician is something I've heard this before. Something people really like when they look at sperm donors. Has a master's degree in artificial intelligence and was working on his PhD as a neuroscience engineer. Right? So this is what he told the sperm bank. Who was he really? Well, there's a list at the bottom. What sort of things? He was a schizophrenic. What else? These are important items, so I'm going to actually write them down. Yeah. So he's a schizophrenic. Sorry. So he's a schizophrenic. He has a criminal record. What else?
He's been hospitalized multiple times.
Yeah, he's been hospitalized. In particular, just to make sure we're using the term the same way, mental hospital, right? What else? The list goes on.
He's bipolar.
What's that?
Bipolar.
Oh yeah, 5'4". We didn't even get into height. There's a weird thing about height. Did you guys catch this? You're not allowed to donate sperm. How tall do you have to be to donate sperm usually? Over 5'8". That's I was surprised by that. That's like a lot of people are not over 5'8", right? So yeah, he's short. Okay, what else?
He was bipolar and has narcissistic personality disorder.
Bipolar, narcissist, personality disorder. Did anybody catch the things he got arrested for?
Fraud.
What's that?
Fraud.
Breaking and entering, trespassing, drunk driving. Well, so there's a discrepancy, right? Did we catch how many kids people have?
36.
He had 36 kids via the sperm bank, right? From 24 different couples. So on the surface, how do you want to read this? Like, there's a reaction that probably most people are going to have, right? This is going to be kind of different from where the article's going to take us. Do you guys have a...
No, I can read narcissistic personality.
Yeah, I misspelled it too, which doesn't help.
This is kind of a question regarding that, but like,
Yeah.
what's the difference just between a narcissist and like the narcissistic personality disorder? Is that just like a...
Well, I think it's the same thing, but a narcissist is not like, if I'm just like really arrogant, I think a lot of myself I'm a narcissist, but I might not be in the DSM, right? I think that's all it is. Is there a psych person here?
I'd say the psych class. So if I remember correctly, I'm not sure if this is the same term for sociopaths, but it's along that line of it's a dissociative personality disorder, which means
Yeah.
a lot of personality disorders, they cause you personal distress that you have them, and this one you don't, so you just don't care that you have this and you don't really care about people. So it's just serious enough that how the definition is.
Yeah. Yeah, dissociative disorders. Anyways, so, sorry, I got distracted for a second. So how do we want to react to this on the surface? Are you comfortable with the idea that if you were to go and use a sperm bank, you know, you think you're getting a 6'2" like neurosurgeon who is a musician and has a high IQ and speaks Swahili, and then all of a sudden you find out that you have, you know, sperm from somebody who is, you know, an ex-con who likes to drink and drive, who dropped out of college, right? Can't hold down a job. How do we want to react to that as an idea? Just like on the surface.
Gets disappointed and upset.
Yeah, and then so like the idea is that like this should, like on some level this is automatically upsetting to people. And that's kind of the impulse that the article wants to draw on and be like, why? Right? Because are all these things genetic? So I didn't even put, sorry, I didn't put that he's unemployed and undereducated. Which of these are not probably genetic? It's kind of a trick question as we move forward. Which ones are not kind of genetic?
The criminal record?
Yeah. In fact, I think we even talked about that in class when we were talking about biological explanations of crime. Like generally speaking, criminologists are pretty wary of them, right? So his criminality is probably not biologically driven. What else?
His unemployment.
Yeah, unemployment gets explained by things other than biology all the time. What else? Yeah, that doesn't seem to be a biological component. In fact, like, people with higher IQs often have similar dropout rates to people with lower IQs. I mean, also you could say that IQs actually might not be a real thing, which a lot of people do. Yeah, you could say that about which ones? So with the rest of them, are they necessarily biological? This is kind of an important key component of this article. Anyone catch this? Because do we normally think of these things as solely biological? You don't think most people think of schizophrenia as just like you're either born with the schizophrenia gene or you're not? First of all, do people know? No one knows what causes schizophrenia. It's actually kind of a mystery. No one has ever actually figured it out. Like, there's a lot of discussion about whether schizophrenia actually exists or whether it's just sort of like a psychological catch-all term. So there's some idea that like people have schizophrenia and it's biological, bipolar is something biological, right? But is it necessarily biological according to what psychologists would say now? It's getting into some complicatedness.
Like when people relate it to their biology, like certain things in your environment can affect you as well.
Yeah, so that's where they want us to take it, is that, like, what psychology now says is, you may have genes that predispose you to being schizophrenic, but you can have those genes your entire life and never develop symptoms, right? And a lot of people do. You could be predisposed to being bipolar, and you might never be bipolar, right? I don't know anything about what people say about narcissistic personality disorder, but generally speaking, it's probably true. That it takes certain combinations of environmental factors and biology to make things happen, right? So we have a tendency to think of, and so our article is really interested in how does the shift away from thinking about disorders as, like, I have genes, those genes make me a schizophrenic, to something very different from that. How does that affect the way in which we interact, think about, and react to people who are disabled. So that's kind of the premise here. So let's go ahead and start looking in the text. So let's go to page 30. Pretty early on. And let's pick up at before we start reading this, Collins and Hanson's. Those are the only two families that sued over it. So 2 families sued over this. The rest of the families didn't. So let's go ahead and get a volunteer to read. I'm going to just start picking people if people don't get better about volunteering, by the way. How do you guys talk now? Let's get somebody who doesn't normally talk.
I'll read it, I guess.
You talk a lot too. How about you guys over here? Not all of you. Some of you guys talk a lot. Some of you don't. The people who sit farthest away from me. So page 30, starting at this very last sentence that reads Collins and Hanson's. I think she's gonna do it. She's just finding it. The paragraph starts with upon uncovering this.
And where do you want me to start?
At Collins and Hanson at the very end of the. It's like almost not on the page.
Collins and Hanson's assertion.
Yep.
Oh yeah. Collins and Hanson's assertion that they would not have a known use of the history of mental illness most obviously contrasts within the notions of genetics that continue to inflict contemporary understandings of body difference. Multiple social inequalities are being produced by underlying genetic, biological abnormalities that can be medicalized, monitored, and proactively guarded against. In this article, the factors are distributed from the institutional creation of swing data to the case of under 9623. In particular, we intend to raise the contemporary discourses of medicalization have shifted from the focus on obviously clear-cut categories of genetic ingredients and pathology to spectrums of susceptibility that is interest at all levels of life, simultaneously constraining and expanding possibilities for disability justice.
Yeah, so here we get, right, and it's basically a reiteration of what we were saying, but it introduces this term, right, which is talking about spectrum, right, pathology of spectrum. And we're going to see how, so on one level it conjures up, right, like, so thinking about this idea, right, by looking at this patient and being like, well, he shouldn't reproduce, right? That does, on some level, conjure up images of sort of like whether genetically, right, he's worthy of breeding, which is a very eugenics-y sort of way of thinking, right? So that's one level. And you can think about it too, like we throw out, especially throughout all versions, all people who are disabled cannot donate to sperm banks. So you could be like the nicest, well-adjusted person in the world with the best family, with you know, a great career and like, I don't know, like 3 yachts. But if you have a cochlear implant, they might not let you donate, right? Which is kind of screwed up, is kind of the point, right? So on one level, like the way in which we get trapped into thinking about cases. Is anyone familiar with how you pick people at a sperm bank, by the way?
Not.
I'm not saying like, yeah, obviously you guys aren't like probably having children via in vitro fertilization yet, but like, we watch TV, right? Like,
I'm a movie and they're like, fine, like, you're gonna hate this. It's like, it's just like,
that's exactly how it is, right? And so like people, you know, essentially go through these files and pick people. If you're a sperm bank, what kind of people do you want to have on your reams of paper?
Probably all like captain is smart.
Yeah, you're gonna want people who people are gonna pick, right? That's kind of the idea. So there becomes like this sort of like marketing-driven weirdness that is in and of itself like this blatant sort of form of eugenics, right? So there's something interconnected already on the surface, right? Let's dig more into this spectrum and how spectrums are, the idea of spectral biology, right, is going to change things. I'm going to just make somebody else read the next paragraph. Who wants to read? Looking for new volunteers. Yeah, 31, being fine right now. And of course, every single one of the people who don't normally come. How about, I'm gonna call on you. Yeah.
Alright. Being fine right now marks the fate of Collins and Hanson's son as not fully biologically determined, but rather as a risky social biological possibility. This perspective echoes studies in psychology and neurogenics, which have, for decades, shown that differences like schizophrenia are co-constituted by our biology and by our social, cultural, political, and economic environments.
I'm going to pause and have you jump down to this evidence. It's right after citation.
This evidence offers feminists and disability scholars and activists a robust opening through which we can push for the creation of more equitable structures, institutions, and relations, environments that can support more just ways of living with and across differences of the mind and body.
Okay, so one of the outcomes of this shift, right, that's being described, that provides the background for this study, to thinking about biology rather than this sort of determinate thing, to something more spectral, is it, did anybody catch this? What's the implication of this for people, and it cites both feminist and disability scholars, probably the two groups of people who care about the money, or the body the most. I never even introduced it, we're doing the body this week. Anyways. So, what does it allow? It allows them to what? It's the last thing that you read. It essentially allows them to push for change, right? So like, if the biological differences are often, right, tied up with our environment, it allows people to be like, what we really need is we need more equitable environments for people who are disabled, right? Whether mentally or physically. Rather than sort of like this demonization of it, right? That's kind of, so that's like, if you will, and if you haven't noticed, sociologists love to do this sort of thing where they talk about positives and negatives. Like they don't usually want to call something good or bad, but it ends up being like both kind of an opportunity and something else. A danger, right? So what's the danger? This is the paragraph right below it, where it says yet. Just gonna wind my way through people who don't normally come. How about you? You see where we're at? Cool.
Yeah.
Great,
Yeah.
thank you.
Yet more often than not, contemporary liberalizations of genetic risks are thoroughly medicalized, thereby reducing a focus on personal health responsibility and on individualized solutions. This is certainly the case with Collins and Hanson's child, whose risk is interpreted as existing along a personalized spectrum of possibilities, which anticipate the need for extensive and ongoing monitoring and intervention.
Okay, I'm gonna pause you there. And I'm going to make you jump down to the very last, it's only part of the sentence, this approach. See that? It's the very end of that page.
This approach leaves us waiting to reveal the projected potential risks to our present-day health and future outcomes, or to the health and outcomes of our actual or hypothetical offspring. In this way, the spectrum is also spectral. Disability as an object of dread haunts the present through anxieties about a past that threatens to paint or even become the future. Trauma, toxic exposure, historical and interpersonal violence and oppression, marking the bodies of the past, haunting the future yet to come.
Okay. So what's the description here? How do we think of our, I guess, biology and the threat of disability? Something very different about. What do you think? Yeah.
Do you think it's something that's like passed down through generations or from person to person?
So there's this thing about the past. Yeah, we'll have to get into that. Past, present, future. Right? There's that whole formulation. So within this spectrum, what's the past that's going to determine disability?
Just like what they have, what their parents have, what their grandparents have.
So on one level we have genes, right? What else do we have? Here's like a list. Trauma, toxic exposure, historical and interpersonal violence and oppression, right? So basically, like, if you think about it, like now we've kind of like turned disability into this thing where it's like this laundry list of things that happen to us, threatening things that happen to us, have the ability to possibly affect our present or our future. Right? So we live in the wake of the risk of disability. Okay, so there's another detail in here. Talks about individualizing. You guys catch that? That, contemporary mobilization of genetic risk are thoroughly medicalized, thereby reproducing a focus on personal health responsibility and individuality, and on individualized solutions. So, under this understanding, whose fault is it if you're disabled? Increasingly, the way that people think of it. So what does this open things up to? Okay, so if you're thinking solely genetics, I have certain genes, bam, that's the explanation, right? Is a person responsible for their own mental and physical problems? No. We don't like as a society. We've talked about this a lot. If there's like one thing you take out of sociology, as a culture, we hate thinking about anything as existing within larger institutions, right? We're almost allergic to it in the United States, right? So like this says there's structural conditions, right? But how does that get interpreted by people? Whose fault does it become?
So I just have a quick question. Are you trying to make the point that that our mental health or the way that we think or psychological whatever is not dependent on the individual but on the environment that the individual is in?
That's what essentially what the psychology is saying, right? So the psychology is saying that these larger environmental factors affect things, and it's not specifically individualized. But when we hear this, what we hear is we hear that people are responsible for, right, their own mental and physical health. So in another ways, like this becomes a method of blaming people, right, for their own problems with their bodies, right? And so that's one of the points being made here. So there's one more point to be made, which also goes to somewhat of a reason why, to some degree, we want to revert to that culturally. How nerve-wracking is the idea for you that people who have schizophrenia just have schizophrenia genes? Versus how nerve-wracking is it for you that you could have schizophrenia genes, that your parents could have them, that your grandparents could have them, and you just never noticed, and if you get in a stressful enough situation, guess what? You might wake up one morning and you're schizophrenic. Which is a more frightening idea to you?
Well, personally, to me, I think the first one, because I know that I have it, and I just don't know when it could emerge. But if I don't know that I have it, and all of a sudden it emerges, it's like, oh, well, I guess I do have it.
Well, what if, if we think it's just genes, nobody in my family is schizophrenic, right? I don't know anybody in my family that has a mental problem. Heck, I have a lot of families that heavily drink, and I don't even have any alcoholics in the family, right? I could just look at it and be like, hey, I got great genes. No worries, right? How's that different if you're talking about this sort of spectrum way of thinking about biological difference? Yeah, and so the idea is in a weird way, disability becomes something that haunts the back of our mind. And our author points to this idea that we often do this linguistically. Did anybody catch this? This is in... Whenever I bring up something that I didn't plan on talking about, it's always hard for me to find.
Are you talking about how the two different definitions of spectrum?
What's that?
Are you talking about how she took the two different definitions of spectrum and kind of carved it together?
No, we're not quite. That's not what I was pointing at. What I was pointing at is did anybody catch culturally when we speak about disability, we'll often talk about it as if we could have some of it, right? So you hear people talk about being a little bit OCD, right? You hear people say, well, aren't we all just kind of a little autistic, right? You have people who don't have attention hyper ADHD who will talk about being hyperactive, right? They're not saying that medically they're hyperactive, they're just identifying that they have similar traits. So people have this weird philosophy, right, already in mind that there's sort of this possibility that they have things in a gradated way, and that those things could get worse, right? So basically the idea is that now disability becomes sort of this existential threat, right, as opposed to just something that happens to those other people. And so there's a danger to it that they can become more actively hostile. We can think about this is actually really close to the way we talked about marginal whiteness before. Do you guys remember this when we were doing the blackface article? You guys remember the marginal whiteness stuff? Yeah. So what was the explanation our author was giving for why marginal whites have a tendency to be more overtly racist? What was the explanation we were talking about?
So it's kind of a defense mechanism because they're so low on the social spectrum that they're just happy that someone else is lower than them, and they like them more.
Yeah, it's even like this threat, right? To, if you will, like, there's this threat for marginal white populations that they might lose their whiteness, right? That they, so essentially, like the category of white isn't assumed for them, right? There's a threat of it. In the same way, like, we can think about, like, people are more likely to be overtly hostile towards people with disabilities as a result of living in this existential threat. So on the one hand, it becomes an opportunity for disability advocates. On the other end, right, there's this sort of latent danger to it. And a latent danger particularly to sort of slip into eugenics ways of thinking for even people who would normally be identified as healthy. Okay, we'll continue with this article on Friday and hopefully get into the next one. Is anybody, and I wanted to ask this, you can just think, you don't have to, you can keep on packing up. Is anybody here planning on going into medicine? Medicine? Yeah, and so actually, like, sociology of the body in medicine isn't usually a chapter in an intro textbook. I include it because they put it on the MCAT. So, like, I always get medical students. So I'm like, well, let's specifically talk about medicine for a while. I love it. Actually, this is my favorite journal, even though, but audience society. Anyways.
I don't know.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And like the experience of playing craft down, the Ramsey kind of been
I did not. I have 20 from, I do skip a meal every Wednesday night.
Thank you.
Facebook, I need to make sure he knows.
Yeah.
Like, I did one comment, but it felt like.
I just said that.